Welcome to another episode of Bright-Headed Publishing Book Club. I am your host, Kelly Morgan. Today I'm excited to bring you a new author, Hollywood Capone. He's written a wonderful book called The Ashes, kind of a homage to a friend that passed away unexpectedly. So happy that he's decided to be a member of the book club and share his book and his writing journey. I can't wait for you to meet him, so there's no reason to wait any longer. Welcome to our book club, new author, Hollywood Capone. Hollywood, thank you so much for being a member of the book club and being on the podcast. Welcome. How are you?
I'm great, and I'm glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
You are so welcome. So I'm so excited to talk to you. First of all, I got to say you have the coolest name I've ever come across, right? Hollywood Capone is a very cool name. Just FYI, just thought I'd share that. But we're here to talk about your book and your journey as an author. So before we get into the book and all that, I always have one question that I like to always ask authors is, did you know that you always wanted to be an author, or did you kind of just stumble into being an author?
A little bit of both. That makes sense. Yeah, I always wrote poetry. I've been in and out of rock bands my entire life. I've written dozens and dozens of songs. None of them went anywhere. I always wanted to write something long form and tried to in fits and starts, but this is the only thing that really ever happened for me, and it happened by accident.
So tell me about that accident.
That accident was the death of my best friend. And he did something ridiculous, which was common to his life and the way he did things. And just for 50 some odd years, I guess he just had an awful lot of luck. But one day he climbed up a set of ladders. He rigged up this Rube Goldberg kind of sequence of build a better mousetrap ladders to get to the roof on his grandmother's house so he could hang up a piece of wood trim this big. And when he was up at the top, it all slipped out from under him, and then the rest, as they say, is history.
Wow. So that kind of catapulted you to write the book?
Yeah, I mean, he was a guy that I'd known my entire life, almost. You know, I met him in the 5th grade when I just moved from one town to another. I knew nobody. His mom was my math teacher, and we just kind of struck up a friendship just because, you know, he was probably one of the only people that bothered to, you know, talk to me or engage me. I was 5th grade, and I moved into this upper class neighborhood at the time, coming from a very solidly middle class neighborhood, and these people didn't really take to me too kindly. They looked at me like an outsider, but he was one of the only people initially that just befriended me, and it started at that point, and it just became a lifelong friendship that went on forever.
So was the book a homage to him?
It is, in a sense. I started writing it. It was a really weird deal because I was having a really hard time with it, you know. People are in your lives, and you don't ever expect anything like that to happen, and when and if it does, it's a body blow, you know. And I just never saw it coming. I just pictured one day him and I just being old guys and, you know, sipping beer on his porch and being goofy, and this outcome never even crossed my mind. And when it happened, I sat down one day to write a paragraph to kind of describe to myself how I was feeling. I needed a way to help my way through that, you know. And that paragraph turned into 2, and that turned into a chapter, and that turned into another chapter. And next thing I know, I had a story on my hands, and I just kind of wrote it out. It really wrote itself. I didn't really do anything except type words.
So, did you self-publish the book? I
did. Yep, I did it on Amazon, and I formatted it for Kindle as well. And then I had this brilliant idea. I was going to do the audiobook version of it, and I figured, well, I'll just record the audiobook version, and then everybody will like it, and it'll be great. And it didn't quite work out that way. There's something about my voice, and when I hear it, it didn't play the way I really wanted it to. And it took me the better part of 9 months to narrate that, to get it to a point where I said, okay, this is something I feel comfortable putting out there and letting people listen to. But it took me so long to figure out how to tell a story with inflection and enunciate properly. And, you know, me, as I speak in the world, I don't know, I'm not going to say I mumble, but I skate over some words or skate over some syllables. But when you're narrating a book like that, you can't really do that. Yeah, you have to present it in a way that's sounds pleasant to the ear as well as it makes the story make sense.
Yeah, and they're listening to your story, so they're gonna take what your inflections and the highs and the lows all come from the narrator. Yeah, audiobooks are a great thing. They're just not an easy thing. I know, because I'm in the middle of recording mine, and I've recorded it 3 times, didn't like any of them, have gone back to the drawing board. I'm gonna start again just because I found myself changing words, right? Just little words, to and the. But when I go back and read it, I'm like, that's not what the book says. So I have to stay with what the book says. That's a challenge. And
there's a thing too, that sometimes when you're writing, you don't write to say the words. You write to mean the words. So when you go back and say them, sometimes you string these words together that God himself would have difficulty saying in a row. Sometimes the consonants and the way the vowels interact with each other, you're like, there's no way I can say that, Yes,
but you wrote it that way. So yeah. So tell us about the book. What's the name of the book?
The book is called The Ashes. This is a copy of it right here. I called it that because ultimately my friend was cremated, and that's a big part of the story. And really, I begin the story almost in nonfiction. There's some fiction in it, but it's more or less a me way of telling a story. I visit the hospital. My dad was very close with him as well, because we all I grew up, and Allan was at my house a lot, and we went on camping trips together. So my father was really tight with Allan as well. And so I begin it as nonfiction, but as the book progresses, after his death in the book, I needed a way to tell the story of the end of his life. And the end of his life was kind of complicated for me. And this is a big part of the reason I had a hard time with it, is because his parents, and I feel for them terribly, but they must have been so devastated by it. But there was no ceremony after his death. There was no monument. There was really nothing. He died in the hospital, and they cremated him, and that was it. There was nothing else after that. And it was a big letdown for me personally, but for a lot of people as well, because he was a very popular guy in our town. He was on the town council. I mean, he's one of those people that just kind of connected with everybody. And there was this whole big, just giant letdown in this area where it was just like, what next? And there was no what next. So I kind of fictionalized the way that he died. He was cremated, but in the book, he winds up being consumed by a giant snake of fire. And I did some kind of cool thing. I think it's cool anyway, but the snake only speaks in poetry. So if you read the book, when the snake is speaking, the snake speaks in poetry, and it gives it a kind of a diabolical tone to it.
So is that the only book that you've published so far, Capone?
It is the only one I've published, but I don't want this to sound the wrong way, but Allan did me one of the greatest favors anyone's ever done for me my whole life. He gave me this, and it was an opportunity for me to not just write about him and say goodbye or whatever way I spin it, but it was also an opening of a door. Right now I'm 20,000 words deep into my second book, which is all fiction, but it basically, writing this gave me the confidence and told me that, I can do this. And the second book is way deeper. It's got a lot more characters. It's a completely fictional story, and I even took the artistic license of bringing my buddy back in the book, because I can't have him here in reality, so I'm gonna have him there in fiction.
So you're working on your second novel. Did you ever think that you would be saying that? I'm now working on my second novel.
No, I'll be honest with you. I wish I was doing this 20 years ago. But it's just one of those things. I said that to somebody. I said that to a musician friend I've known for a long time. This guy, Brian Fitzpatrick, the local musician around this area, writes a lot of original stuff. I've been in and out of clubs. We've been on the same circuit for 20 plus years. I just run into him all the time. And I ran into him last weekend, And I was telling him about this, and he was, congratulating me on the book, and we were just talking about stuff. And he's got a great career too. He does a lot of video work behind the scenes. Nobody knows, a lot of the stuff he does, but he's out there. He produces a lot of work. And he said to me, I told him what I just said to you. I said, I wish I was doing this 20 years ago. And he said, you know what? You weren't ready. And that really, it struck a tone with me. I was like, you know what? He's right. I wasn't ready. 20 years ago, I was in a rock band, playing till 3 o'clock in the morning, and nothing like this was on my radar back then.
So now that you said that you're 20,000 words into the second book, the first book is out there. How do you market the book?
I do it haphazardly. I'm a terrible business person. I'm reaching out to people, podcasts much like yours. I'm trying to get the word out there, but also I do it, through social media, anywhere and everywhere. Anywhere I go, I talk up the book. I have a day job, and I have a copy of it sitting on a book stand in my office. And it's kind of vain, but the back cover has my picture on it. So a lot of times when people come into the office, they say, "Hey, that's your book," and then we chat it up a little bit. And it's I wish there was an easy way to do it, but there's not, and it takes a lot of work, and I'm okay with that. You know what I mean? It's not like I intended to sell 10 million copies of this book. It was just more or less a story for me to write for myself, to kind of put this whole thing to rest for me, and a byproduct of that is I've got a cool story now, and I'd like to share it.
What made you publish it? Because writing the book is one thing, publishing is another. So what made you say, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to publish it.
Well, I figured I'd gotten that far because when I finished the book, it wasn't formatted for publishing or anything. I wrote it on in Mac. Its writing program is Pages, right? So I wrote it on Pages, and I didn't write it in a book format. I wrote it just like one page after another. So when I read the book finally back to myself, and I gave it to my dad and a couple close friends to read through and say, "Hey, what do you think of this?" It was a bunch of pages all stapled together, and but it read, and it's a cool little story. And a friend of mine, I was on a flight with him to Vegas. We did a convention in Vegas 2 years ago for the car business, the North American Dealers Association, and he read it on the plane out there. And he gets off the plane. He's like Hollywood. He's like, I can't believe you did this. This is great. You got to publish this. And it was something I was thinking already, but him saying that just kind of put the icing on the cake for me. I said, you know what, I really do. And part of me just wanted to legitimize it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does make sense. Did you have somebody, like an outside person, edit it for you? Or did you just take it from the raw form and put it on Amazon? What'd you do?
No, I began to go through it a lot myself, because when I type, I type fast, and I tend to type a lot of errors. And then I go back and I look at them. And as I write, I try and go back and read through it. I correct what I can see when I do it. But going back and reading through it as a completed manuscript, there's a lot of spelling errors. So it took me some time to go through that and correct all of them, which there's still a few in there. I missed a few, but it's less than half a dozen, and I feel it's okay. But formatting it actually for like font and font size, I subbed that out, and I had that done because they formatted it for Kindle for me as well, and that end of it made more sense. I proofread the whole thing myself, but other than that, I subbed it out.
So on your next book, you say it's completely fiction. Are you going to self-edit that as well?
I am, and that's gonna be more of a challenge for me, because I'm writing that not haphazardly, but there's a lot more involved with it. This book was basically a story, and as the writer, I was more like narrating it, and there was only a couple characters in the story. There's two characters. There's the cowboy, there's the kid, who's my friend Allan, there's the snake of fire, and then there's a couple transient characters, which are people in the hospital, briefly his parents, my father's in it briefly. So those characters were easy to write because there really wasn't a lot going on with them. The main characters are the cowboy, the kid, and the snake of fire. And they were easy to write for me at that point because I was really deep into them. The two main characters, the kid and the cowboy, were myself and my buddy, and the snake of fire was the evil that eventually consumed him. And I had an easy road with that, but the new story is far more complex. There's a lot more characters, and that is a difficult thing to write when you're trying to write for individual characters as opposed to writing from a position of a narrator.
So how did you come up with your storyline for this new book?
I started that much the same way as I started this, only not from a place of pain and anguish. I started it from a place where I was just basically sitting there looking at the page and saying, what am I going to write about? So I opened the new book. The new book has a number of characters. There's some animals in it that are sentient. So they're alive, and they're aware they're alive, and they're doing the things that these animals do. And one of the animals is a hawk, and his name is Horace. And the book opens with Horace out looking for his morning meal. And his morning meal winds up being this squirrel who cannot be named because rodents don't have names. And it takes this sequence. It begins with the squirrel beginning his day with his morning meal, and Horace out flying looking for his morning meal. And at some point they come together, and Horace gets his meal and the squirrel gets the short end of the stick. But it's the beginning of a day where the sun's rising. I live in Bergen County, New Jersey, so when the sun rises here, it puts a golden hue on New York City. And if you have a view of it, it's one of the most beautiful things you ever see. The city is just this golden color, and the sun's coming up, and there's all this light kind of stuff happening. And I go into it and I describe that in great depth, and that's really the opening scene of the book, and it just kind of went on its way from there.
So now that you've got the one book out there, you've got one book in the hopper, would you now call yourself an author?
Some people have said that to me, and it just feels so weird because I'm at a point right now. I think after the second book, if I grind my way through it and the story is legit and I legitimize it by publishing it, I think if I publish the second book, I'll feel legit enough to say that. I don't know if I'm worthy of the that term right now, author or writer. When people ask me about it, I call myself an accidental author right now because it was an accident. It wasn't my accident. All I really did was tell the story. It's it comes from my heart and it comes from things I feel, but it wasn't like I set out to plan to do it, and it's not like it's my career either. It's far from it. But after the second one, I think I would have no problems with that.
So let me ask you a question, Hollywood. Have you ever thought about taking all your songs and poems and putting them into a book?
I have, and it's some of them I think are very creative and ready for prime time, and some of them need to be forgotten where they already have been forgotten. But I've written some cool stuff. I'm not going to say I haven't, and I write in fits and starts. I can write 5 poems and then leave them and let them sit there, and 6 months go back and look at them, and one of them really hooks me, and the others I'll be like, and maybe that's the same way for a lot of people that write. I don't know, but it's just kind of how it works for me.
So that could be book number 3.
You
have all the material.
A friend of mine says, I started doing this thing. My parents are older, right? And they both have some serious problems. My mother has dementia, and my father's going through that right now as well. And at the beginning stages of that with my father, just going back a couple of years ago, even before this happened and I wrote the book, I started, I've been a professional photographer for years. I do a lot of event photography, like weddings, parties, bar mitzvahs, and I do like headshots and actors and stuff like that too. But so I started taking a camera out to my father's house. I would go out and see him once a week, and we were restoring an old car at the time, and I started taking pictures of him. And I would just pose him, just for a couple, He had a couple really old cars too. He had a 48 Buick and a 39 Buick, a 55 Chevy. Some cool stuff, And I pose him next to some of these cars. I'm like, Dad, I want to take a picture of it. He's like, what are you doing? Stop that. But I would take a couple shots. And I started doing that religiously, week after week after week, until I got to the point where I had hundreds of these cool photos of my older dad, with these old cars or in the shop or wherever. And I mentioned it to a friend of mine, and she said, you know what? She's like, you should do a coffee book about that. So what I was thinking is taking some of the poetry and writing some newer poetry, and taking the photos and maybe writing, you know, a little poem or something for each one, and that's in the hopper too.
That's actually a really good idea. You got to let me know when you get that done. Obviously, we've got to wait for the second book to come out, and then we'll look at the copybook. But I'm saying, when you said that you wrote songs, because songs are basically poetry, right? That's all they are. So I thought, well, guy, maybe you're a poet author. You just don't know it yet.
Well, you know, it's funny because when I finished, I'm getting a little choked up now. When I finished the book, I let my wife read it first, and she sent me this coolest text. She's like, you know, this is a really cool story. And coming from her, I was, because at first I was nervous, you know, I was like, oh my God, you know, I'm going to let her read this, you know, this could be sink or swim here, you know, because if it's a turd, you know, she'd probably say so, you know. And when she said that to me, I said, you know what, that was probably one of the coolest things I've ever heard.
And see, and now look at you now. The book is out there. You've got the second book. You've even got an idea for a third book. I honestly think it's okay if you were to actually refer to yourself as an author.
Thank you so much.
I think you'll be okay, because that's how I'm going to refer to you, as Author Hollywood Capone. So, I mean, you know, Hollywood, I think, you know, writing is no easy feat. It takes a lot of courage not to put it on paper, but to put it out there for everybody to judge, right? For the world to see and put whatever comments they want or reviews. And I think that's why so many people don't put themselves out there, is because they're afraid of whatever backlash. And then you find out that it doesn't even matter what people think about your book. Honestly, it only matters what you think about your book. And if you believe it to be a work of art, then, you know, God damn it, it's a work of art, sir. So I congratulate you on the feat of getting the book out there and paying homage to your friend. I think it's a wonderful thing you did. I can't wait to hear the second book, because what you told me, it sounds intriguing. So, you know, you've got this imagination, obviously, right? And so you're putting things on paper. Are you the type of writer that do you sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write? Or does it just come to you and then you're thinking, oh, I got this great idea, I think I'm going to go write? Or is it a little bit of both?
The start is always the hardest thing for me, because I never know where I'm going to start. But once I start, then I know where I'm going. And then, like the new book, you know, it's funny, like, people ask me about the new book, you know, like, what's the story? And I'm I guess a good third of the way into it. I more or less, up to this point, I've been developing the characters and giving them life and giving them personalities, and then, you know, I'm really at the tail end of that, and I'm starting my second act, which is basically going to be, you know, how the story begins. And in that second act, that's something that I've been brooding over while I've been writing the first act of it. And I know where that's gonna, I don't know where it's gonna go, but I know where it's gonna start. And that story, I'm curious myself to see how it ends, because I don't know. You know, people say, you know, what's the new book about? And I'm like, well, it's about a bunch of high school kids that save the world. And in essence, that's what it is. But how does it end? I don't know.
Well, for a lot of writers, they don't, you know, they sit down and they'll just get what they call a download. Just information, just downloads into their brain. And next thing they know, they're putting it on paper. And I think that's what happens for most writers. I think it's something that can't be forced. You just have to allow it to come, right? And just get your download. And if there's nothing there, it's okay. It will come. And it usually does when you least expect it to. That's how it was for me. I'd just be like, oh my God, I got this great idea. Next thing you know, I'm scribbling stuff down because I'll forget it. So, you know, sir, yes, you are an author. What, do you have a name for the second book?
It's called The Vital Few.
The Vital Few. Hollywood, it has been a pleasure having you on the podcast. I loved hearing about your journey. The book is called The Ashes. Is it available everywhere?
It's available on Amazon. It's available on Audible as an audiobook, and it's formatted for Kindle. All of it's available on Amazon, and that can be found on Amazon by searching Hollywood Capone, The Ashes, or you can find it on my Insta too, Instagram/Hollywood Capone.
Fantastic. I will make sure that the readers have a link to get to your book. And I thank you so much for being a part of the book club.
Look, thank you so much for having me. The pleasure's all mine, and I've had a great time, and I can't thank you enough for having me. It's wonderful.
Well, the goal of the podcast is to help you find readers and to help readers find you. So hopefully, if we have one person that goes out and gets your book, The Ashes, I have done my job.
Thank you so much.
You are very welcome. Thank you for listening to another episode of Bright-Headed Publishing Book Club. I have been your host, Kelly Morgan. I just wrapped up with new author Hollywood Capone as he talked about his book, The Ashes. The Ashes is available on Amazon. It's available Kindle, book form, and he even recorded an audiobook. Good for you, Hollywood. Next week, another author. But in the meantime, if you're an author and you would like to be a member of the book club and promote your book, all you got to do is just go to the website, www.brightheadedpublishing.com. Drop me a note. I'm sure the readers and the listeners would love to hear all about you, your book, and your journey. Our goal for this podcast is if we can bring authors and readers together, we have done our job. Next week, a new episode with a new author and a new book. I can't wait. Thank you so much for being a member of the book club and listening. In the meantime, keep writing.